Hi Undertale and Deltarune fans! Welcome to the first video on my YouTube channel. Before I get into things, I want to preface this by giving some background on what this video is. Of course, the baseline is that this is an analysis of Undertale and Deltarune, which I hope you will all find interesting. More importantly to me, however, is that this is a presentation I previously gave at the University of Pittsburgh's 2026 Queer Horror Conference. This video acts firstly as a way for me to archive the contained script and slides, starting a small portfolio of some of my graduate writings on literary analysis. Just keep in mind that this was initially written for a general academic audience. Sorry if you find that some of this is too simple or surface level for your refined, hyperfixated tastes. If this video goes up when I intend it to, it should still be Pride Month, so happy Pride. Hopefully this video sates your need for both Undertale brain rot and its specifically queer varieties. All that said, I'd be interested to hear any thoughts you have on this theme in both Undertale and Deltarune. While this video is largely concerned with the oscillation between daily and otherworldly spaces in the former, I do allude to Deltarune near the end because the same motion is quite clearly a fixation of Fox's. I suggest you watch the Bee's Knees, Metamodernism, Oscillation, and Deltarune here on YouTube if you'd like any further, albeit not specifically queer, readings on this sort of topic. I'll leave a link in the description for you. With that, let's get into it. Speaking before this audience, I'm confident in claiming that most, if not nearly all of us, have some particularly unsettling memories of being in the closet. A few questions come to my mind when I recall how I felt prior to coming out, some of which include, what's going to happen to me? Will people understand who I am? Will they accept me? How do I really know who I am? The list could go on, but the general anxiety that each question evokes for me is deeply rooted within a fear of the unknown. For the years during which I remained there, the closet was synonymous with safety and security despite its limitations. To venture outside would be to face the unknown, and through that, my anxiety assured me, it would also be to face a sort of death, whether of my social standing and identity, or through real bodily threats and harm. Today, I've long since gathered the courage to find my way out of that darkness. However, the terror that I associate with the unknown remains just as fascinating and otherworldly. My interests in horror echo this fascination with the unknown, as I find myself most drawn to empty moments and implications of horror, much more than I am drawn to gore or thrilling chase sequences. The former are quiet promises that something will happen, followed by a more terrifying mundanity in which nothing does. Beyond that, I'm fascinated by works of fiction that explicitly play with this separation between the known or expected and the unknown and terrifying. These thresholds, to me, have come to represent a type of coming out moment, even when the media in question does not inherently feature queer characters. The fear there always carries largely the same connotations. This notion of boundaries and separation between the real and fictional is well understood by scholars writing on horror. For example, in Manuel Aguirre's Geometries of Terror, Numinous Spaces in Gothic, Horror, and Science Fiction, the numinous world is defined as an opposite to the everyday world in which the ordinary occurs. Aguirre claims that the, quote, Gothic can be said to postulate two zones. On one hand, the human domain of rationality and intelligible events, on the other hand, the world of the sublime, terrifying, chaotic numinous which transcends human reason, unquote. This distinction between typical and atypical realities allows for the presence of monstrous others who exist within the numinous and along the thresholds between reality and fiction. This concept appears repeatedly across fiction, as Aguirre draws attention to the similarities between his thesis and that of Joseph Campbell, who famously defined the hero's journey, in which, quote, the hero leaves his familiar world, enters an other territory by crossing a threshold of danger, reaches the center of the other domain, and after a suitable adventure returns to his world in a symmetrical, chiastic manner, unquote. Despite the commonality of this story arc, the numinous carries a more specific connotation in queer horror, as the passing of thresholds becomes the bulk of the story's content. One such example is seen in Toby Fox's series of video games. For those of us who have played his games, Fox needs no introduction. However, for those who have not, he's primarily known for his two independently developed titles, Undertale and Deltarune. While Deltarune is the more recent of the two, it is currently being released on an episodic basis and has not yet been fully completed. Undertale, alternatively, fully released in 2015 and has since been the subject of academic attention for its subversion of the role-playing game genre's insistence on violence. Where most RPGs rely on the player's systematic slaughter of their enemies to become stronger and prevail, players are encouraged to complete Undertale without killing anyone. Having fallen into an underground full of literal monsters, the player is told that, quote, in this world, it's kill or be killed, unquote. They are then let loose, either to prove or disprove this thesis through their own variable actions. This is not the only appeal to playing Undertale, however, as the game is also inherently queer. The most obvious way to support this claim would be to cite the game's many explicitly queer characters. The player character is consistently referred to with they-them pronouns, regardless of how the user personally identifies or names them in the opening moments. Undyne, the Underground's royal guard, ends up in a lesbian relationship with Alphys, the royal scientist, who herself is implied to be bisexual. Mettaton, another of the game's major bosses, undergoes a facsimile of gender-affirming care, as his original ghost body is transposed into and fused with a new masculine robot body. Further, he gifts one of his old dresses to an unnamed trans-feminine lion character. These and more examples permeate the game's runtime. However, some scholars would claim that the gameplay itself represents a queer alternative to mainstream gaming. Jordan Youngblood, for example, argues that, quote, what develops is a larger system of textual analysis driven by a larger desire to explore the mechanics of games as producing or limiting queerness, and how that extends outward into player communities interpreting and utilizing the game themselves, unquote. In a culture where straight male gaming is still largely defined by its violence and competitive nature, Undertale is seemingly made intrinsically queer by its focus on nonviolence and pacifistic solutions to each of the player's problems. However queer it may be, Undertale is not necessarily a horror game, at least not at first glance. This pacifistic playthrough of the game's story is characterized by its bubbly, optimistic messages about peace and love. As such, many authors discussing Undertale, Youngblood included, will cite the alternative No Mercy route as the game's main source of terror. Given that player choice allows the game to become violent, Youngblood argues that the main terror in Undertale stems from a, quote, philosophical horror. I have done this. Rather than spectator of horror, the player brings it into being and must address its impact upon the game world and, in many ways, themselves, unquote. I will admit that this is true, as it aligns with my own thesis that many queer terrors are inherently tied to the unknown threat of coming out. When committing genocide in Undertale, the main horror affect I experienced was a terror and shock at the idea that I could have done this at all, much less that I could bring such harm to the characters that the pacifist route had convinced me were my friends mere weeks prior. The question then was, what have I become? I would alternatively argue that this is only one of the many multivalent horror affects in Undertale, and that this layering of horror is mirrored by the layering of realities inherent to Undertale and Deltarune stories alike. Terror, in actuality, is not at all missing from the pacifist route. It is primarily represented by the many Numinous realms and the thresholds the player must pass between them, found across the underground. When the player boots up Undertale for the first time, they will be told they have fallen from the surface to the underground, as previously noted. This is the first of many thresholds that the player character crosses. The underground itself is numinous, and therefore Undertale is never not numinous. Each moment of gameplay is accented by the game's initial dangerous encounter, wherein this seed of doubt is planted, that this world is, in fact, kill or be killed. Each moment from then on inspires fear, challenging the player to rise above the terror and walk the pacifist path, one of love and queerness. Toriel, the mother character that serves as the game's tutorial, attempts to facilitate this pacifism, teaching players how the game's mercy system works as they journey across the ruins. Regardless of if the player manages to follow Toriel's example, they will inevitably find themselves leaving the ruins should they desire to continue playing. This represents the first of Undertale's coming out moments, as the game world opens up, literally becoming brighter. We've gone from indoors to an outdoor space, admittedly still numinous because it remains in the underground, called Snowdin. The game's color palette goes from blacks and purples to blues and whites, making the space feel brighter and more outside, so to speak. The tone here is jovial and humorous for pacifist players. However, once the player crosses Snowdin, they find themselves in Waterfall, a damp cave drawn in deep blacks and blues. The tone once more becomes suffocated and mystical, as the player finds themselves returned to a deeper Numinous, despite their attempts to escape it. This pattern continues across Undertale's runtime. Following Waterfall is Hotland, and from there is the core. Each of these spaces oscillate between open and closed, everyday and Numinous, until the player achieves an ending. Along a true pacifist route, this pattern culminates in the most horrific section of a non-genocide playthrough, the True Lab. Undertale's world is never more muted than it is here, and the terror is naturally linked with a queer unknown. This area is closely linked with the aforementioned scientist Alphys, who has been experimenting with life and death to mixed success. She has effectively created zombies out of the corpses of her clients, and is terrified of informing their families. Fear in this moment, for her, is represented by those same questions from earlier. What's going to happen to her? Will people accept her? The player, throughout this area, feels a horror affect tied to the same unknown, as silence drives the area's terror. Quiet horror, as Selma Purak describes regarding the film A Quiet Place, is rarely actually silent, as quietness in oral media is demonstrated by the simultaneous presence and lack of other meaningful sounds. Quote, "When the wind stops or the footfalls cease, death is near. What A Quiet Place lacks is not sound, but spoken dialogue," unquote. Undertale mirrors this false silence in its True Lab. What is missing is not music or sound effects. In fact, the background music in the True Lab is quite catchy. It is that communication falters in the face of the zombie-like amalgamates. The player searches for Alphys as an anchor in this most numinous of spaces, but they do not find her until they have survived their encounters with the monster. There is no dialogue here, only vague lore dumps written in lab reports posted on the dark hallways throughout the lab. The traditional mercy options seem strange in this area's combat, having relatively little logic behind their choices as compared to previous encounters, which told their respective characters' stories through gameplay, via the non-violent solutions to their battles. Once the player completes the True Lab, they are only a few encounters away from completing Undertale's true ending, in which they are tasked with the ultimate mercy: spare the character who originally insisted that the game's world was kill or be killed. Doing so destroys the magical barrier keeping both the player character and monster kind trapped underground, representing the most extreme coming out moment, where no character will ever need to be trapped in the Numinous, and therefore the closet, again. This dispelling of the Numinous is paired with a visual of the rising sun, its bold yellows and oranges warmer than even Hotlands. The horror is not over, however. The monster in the dark in this final moment is you, not the avatar, but the player, the one behind the screen. In the same way that most Undertale scholars are preoccupied by the no mercy route, so too is the game. If you run the program once more, returning to the game world, the final boss stops you along the way. Before you can choose to reset and play the game from the start, he begs you to let this world be. Quote, "I don't think I could do it all again, not after that, so please, just let them go," unquote. In this moment, and truthfully even from the very start, Undertale reveals the last threshold you had been passing this entire time. The veil between fiction and reality, which separates the player from their computer, and their computer from Undertale's program files. And thus, the so-called monster, the entity with the most terrifying power over this numinous sphere, is shown to be the player. This approach to the threshold is later made more obvious in Deltarune, where reality is broken up into our world, then the game program, then the everyday light world, and finally the most numinous dark world. Despite that, Fox's writing is clearly occupied with the motion of in and out, up and down, between realities. Given that each of his games focus on queer identity, it is easy to make the comparison between these thresholds and the metaphorical closet from which many of us have stepped out. Undertale looks back at the player, prompting them with the what-if question. Though this is typically a terrifying question to answer, Fox's game worlds give us the opportunity to respond, allowing us to practice what it is we wish to say, and know exactly who it is that we are going to be. Thanks for listening. Here's a list of the sources I cited during this presentation. If you enjoyed this overview, stay tuned for both a second archival video on Deltarune and for an eventual analysis uniquely made for YouTube covering the transfemme browse theory and the implication that it has for Chris's own identity. I hope to see you all again soon.